So, hi everybody, how are you? Hi, oh good. It's a happy group, good food, nice company. Well, thank you very much for your attention. What I want to do is go back to first principles and just make a few definitions, and then I want to talk about the kind of 8 explanations of Colombian prosperity. I'm going to go through them very, very quickly. And then I want to talk about some of the things Colombia could do going forward. The first thing I want to talk about is prosperity. The word came up several times this morning. Prosperity we can measure in terms of income, purchasing power. We can look at it in terms of its growth and its rate of growth. But the important thing about prosperity is that it provides the opportunity for hopes and aspirations. And the lack of prosperity destroys those aspirations. The reason prosperity is important for Colombia is because it's highly correlated with progressive human values. How's my English? It's really good English, right? Is it nice and clear? So, when prosperity goes up, we see society changing in very important ways. We see interpersonal trust go up. Civic engagement improves. Self-determination increases, the opposite of fatalism. Self-determination gets better. Tolerance for people unlike yourself improves. And your openness to new ideas improves. So when you see President Moreno outside having coffee, and you ask him, what do you do for a living? He can say, I run the bid. He can say, I help in the investment and disbursement of $10 to $12 billion a year. Or he can say that I'm trying to get societies to improve their incomes and to increase the stock of values which strengthen society. When incomes go up, it strengthens society. Now, there's a limit on this. Great scholars at Princeton and Michigan, Ron Inglehart at Michigan, Alex Inkelis at Stanford, they have found that when incomes go up to $5,000 of purchasing, society strengthen because these values improve. Up until about $10,000, and then this relationship changes to something else as people start to believe in their legacy and their reputation and things like that. But right where Colombia is the sweet spot. ¿Cómo se dice sweet spot en español? ¿Cómo se dice? Sweet spot. It's that perfect space. And that's why competitiveness has been so important. Now, our society in Colombia is not improving at the fastest possible rate because even though the average purchasing power is around $10,000 US, in fact, many, many people are still below that. But this is a very important relationship. Incomes strengthen society by getting people out of their survival stride and into a space where they have room in their hearts and their minds to invest in a better society. That's why we do this. It's not export competitiveness. It's not keeping a president in power. It's not having a stronger gremio. It's not even just getting crime off the street. It strengthens our society. Now, there's The best definition of poverty I have ever heard is from that great economist, Pope John Paul. He said, poverty is the exclusion from networks of trade, investment, and learning. It's brilliant. Poverty is the exclusion from networks of trade, investment, and learning. So our job is, how do we connect everyone to those global networks? That's our job. Now, there are 8 explanations for why this doesn't happen. I'm going to give you all 8 really, really fast. The first explanation is the basic factors, which means if you believe that wealth is based on location, sunshine, raw materials, fertile soil, if you believe that's where Colombian wealth comes from, then you're in the basic factor school. But you're in the wrong school, right? Let me tell you why. If a country competes on those advantages, it competes on the most easily imitated advantage a nation possesses. And if you compete on an easily imitated advantage, you must compete on price, how low your price is. Well, if you compete in the global markets on price, you have to keep your wages low, which means the harder you work, the poorer you get. It means the more competition you have, the poorer you get. And it means the only real competition you're in is to see which country can stay the poorest the longest until its society disintegrates. That's the basic factor school. Next school, the macroeconomic school. At the risk of offending macroeconomists in the group, and I'm very aware that there's some famous great economists in this room, I can teach you economics in about 10 seconds. Stabilize, privatize, democratize, and liberalize. Boom. Do you want me to do it again? Because you didn't get it, did you, Eduardo? you. Stabilize, privatize, democratize, and liberalize. That's economics. Open your economy, privatize your firms, stabilize your economy, and decentralize your decision-making. Now, here's the cool thing about Colombia. Up until 1992, the Colombian model of prosperity was based on the basic factor school and the macroeconomic school. So we thought what we could do is sell our raw materials, and when the world stopped purchasing it, we could just devalue the currency. And the plug figure was labor rates. So we devalued the currency, we impoverished the people, but the exports leave our shores. And the economy keeps going and going and going. Then something happened. And I really wish he could be with us today. Gaviria happened. A little bit Barco, but Gaviria happened. He came to power in a non-political way, in a way befitting Colombia's mythical alter ego called Macondo. Gaviria, a little boy, pointed and said, "That man should be president." And he became president. That only happens here. I know you think that's normal. But Gaviria coming to power that way had an extraordinary opportunity because he could pick and choose the cabinet in a brand new way. So he picked younger people, technically trained people, fluent in the world's languages people. And they became, at first, derisively called the Kinder. And then later on, when they proved to be a good group, they were respectfully called the Kinder. Now, I don't know whatever happened to any of those guys. They disappeared in the mysteries of history? No. One of them became president of Colombia. One of them became president of the BID. Others went on to become stars in the academy and the private sector. And what happened was they decided there were other theories about economic development besides basic factors in macroeconomics. So they searched the world and they found new ways to compete. The third school that they brought in was the microeconomic school, the business strategy school. And in that school of thinking, you look at how firms compete, not nations. You look at geographic scope, vertical scope, cost structure analysis, market segmentation, relative competitive position. And when we started to do that, we learned that our flour sector was losing competitiveness because of lower wages in Ecuador. But the dirty little secret at the time, it was the Colombian owners who were investing in Ecuador because of the labor rates being so low. We looked at the textileros and we found their product scope was too big. Some companies had 3,000 products because they didn't have a competitive environment. And they knew they were profitable, but they didn't know which of the products were profitable and which ones weren't. And the petrochemical people were very efficient in their administration, their sales, their operations, but the Venezuelans subsidized the feedstock, the raw material, and that made the Colombians not able to compete. The leather people were atrapado en el medio, between the Italians who focused on design and the Chinese who focused on low costs. And the Colombians were squeezed by both groups. So the microeconomics school began to teach us that there are other ways to do this. How about the institutional school? Rule of law, democracy, clusters of related and supporting industries. Chile and Hong Kong, Singapore, they taught the world you don't have to be democratic, but you have to have a rule of law that protects tangible and intangible property. So we started to think about that in Colombia. The Human Capital School, Gary Becker, the Nobel laureate, who says the greatest quote in the history of economic development, a theme that came up many times today, the only investment with the possibility of infinite returns is the investment in babies. Great line. The only investment with the possibility of infinite returns is the investment in babies. Let's look at the knowledge school. Before, Dr. Reina was talking about how many international patents we have in Colombia. International patents, archives of information, libraries, databases online, knowledge capital. What's the difference between knowledge capital and human capital? Human capital has skills and abilities on legs, and it can get on an airplane, and it can go away. And knowledge capital, the more it's shared, the greater wealth it creates. How about the Human Science School, which is in the Human Capital School? This is the one most of you probably haven't heard about. There's a whole new science that says entrepreneurs are born, not made. That receptors based on your brain, depending on where they're located, give you the opportunity to be generous, trusting, and take rational risks. But if the same receptors are in a different place in your brain, you possess none of those qualities. So the answer is entrepreneurs are born, not made. Very interesting. Big implications for social policy. And then we have the culture school, the most fascinating one of all. Colombia is very rich in the explicit articulation of culture, fashion, music, language. If you go to Cali, you can't swing a cat without hitting a statue. Cali has more statues than any place in the world. They're very fond of honoring their forefathers and mothers. That's an explicit articulation of culture. And in Colombia, it's really interesting, is Colombia is not really a nation state, as we all know. It's a nation filled with little mini nation states. Bucaramanga is my favorite. How many people are here Bumanguesa? How many? Right over there. You look at that black raven hair. Bucaramanga has the highest percentage of Spanish people. And it also has the highest savings rate of any city in the country. And when I asked about that, I was told that's because they're all saving their money to go back to Spain. And do you know what the Bucaramanga town is the second most proud of? The thing they're second most proud of. Remember, Bucaramanga is the town of rebels, fighters for freedom, right? It's their firms are the most vertically integrated firms in the country because it's so isolated and it's very close to Venezuela. What's the second thing, not the first thing they're most proud of, the second thing that Bumangueses are most proud of? Does anybody know? 5 Colombian presidents have come from Bucaramanga. They're very proud of this. But the first thing they're most proud of is 6 Venezuelan presidents have come from Bucaramanga. When you go to Barranquilla, you have to remember that this was the richest city in the country in history of Colombia. Am I right? It had the world's longest dock. It had the second airline in the world after KLM. It had a privileged position next to the Magdalena River. So everything from this part of the world passed through Barranquilla. But in 1914, when the Panama Canal came, it rendered Barranquilla obsolete. And it went from being the Puerto del Oro, am I right? Am I remembering this correctly? To suffering quite a bit over the last 100 years. And the city that became wealthy after that was Medellin. In 1926, it reached its apogee as a global banking center, creating unbelievable amounts of wealth. Colombia's culture is a culture of city-states and mini-cultures, all of which are super fascinating. Cali is the town of visionaries. So, is there another type of culture besides the culture we see everywhere in Colombia? Yeah. There's your mindset, la mente, what we described this morning. The mindset, the mental model. And the Colombian vision, the mental model, is very interesting. Its model of change, typically, traditionally, has been top-down, centralized, based on massive infusion of capital, based on protection, based on underinvesting in the education of the average person. That's been the traditional model. And the model, since the last 20 years, has begun to change that. We're not there yet, but even today there was a lot of discussion about investing in the average children. So here's the image for you. There's a thing called the veil of ignorance. How do you say that in Spanish? I would love to. The veil of ignorance, the veil. Everybody spoke at once. So what happens, policies need to be made behind the veil of ignorance. When Catalina Crane, one of the great champions of this work for 2 decades, when she's considering the education of her children, She has to make a decision that says, as I build policies to help this country, I have to pretend that I don't know which family my children will be raised by. I have to pretend I don't know which school my children will go to. I have to pretend I don't know which town my children will work in. And then build your policies behind a veil of ignorance. That's the only way to do it. Because if we built those policies behind this veil, we would build a country that had the supreme value, which is that no one life is more valuable in this country than any other life. And that's where you see in regions and countries that take off. Now, there are other important values. Seeing the relationship between work and achievement. Now I'm being kind of Confucian. You have to see the relationship between work and achievement, and you have to make sure that babies, as they raise, see that connection too. Belief in competition. Stace Lindsay was all over this morning with his young group of world beaters. Competition fosters human initiative. It spurs innovation. If I go to Silicon Valley and ask about competition, they say, I love to compete even when I win. Even when I lose. I say, even when you lose? Yeah, because when I fail, that's the fastest way to learn. Failure is not a disgrace. It's the fastest way to learn. In Silicon Valley now, you raise money not to achieve economies of scale, to lower the unit price of your product and penetrate a market. You raise money so that you can fail for a year or 2 or 3 before you figure out exactly what you're supposed to be doing. Failure. Embedded in the tax code, the accounting systems, embedded in the very culture. Failure not as a disgrace, but failure as a triumph of figuring out what didn't work, so now you can figure out what does work. I mentioned self-determination. Can I be a little bit aggressive here? May I be aggressive? I have your permission? Someone said sure, but it sounded like an American accent. I'd rather have a contract with a Colombian. If you're Catholic and you come from a country over-blessed by natural resources, and you come from a country with centralized hierarchical decision-making, you're going to probably be poor. That's like a formula. Yeah, these guys, they're disgraced by knowing me now. This is a really big deal because we have to find in our culture these strengths to go ahead and that support innovation. Competition fosters human initiative. Failure is not a disgrace. Decentralized decision-making is absolutely critical. So where does this all leave us today? Those are the schools of thinking. The Kinder brought additional schools into the discussion and changed the country forever. But where does that leave us today? Let me give you a couple of examples. Let's talk about China. In fact, we could just talk about China for the rest of the day. How many people love China and the impact it's had on Colombia? Okay, not a lot of China fans. How many people hate China and the impact it's had on the country? Okay. And how many people think we should make China our partner going forward? Oh, it's a good crowd. That's exactly right. What we should be doing with China, and not just because it'll make the Americans' heads explode, but what we should be doing with China is recognizing that the new global capitalism is Chinese money, African and South American raw materials, South American and North American markets, distribution, brand, and retail. And China is coming. I know for sure that they're about to release an iPad-type tablet that's 80% as good as the Apple iPad and costs $100. That's another sweet spot. And I know for sure that they want to open up distribution and retail in North America and in South America. And I know we can't stop them. I've studied them for 18 months for the president of the African Development Bank. I know exactly what they're going to do. We can't stop them. Now, in Dr. Reyna's presentation, you saw that manufacturing was going down as a percent of total, right? That's because the mining and the minerals was going up as a percent of total. And that's a lot to do with not only Chinese purchases, but Chinese impact on prices. China's coming this way. North America is less and less interested in South America than ever before. And regional integration in South America has moved from around 8 or 9% 25 years ago to something like 25 or 30% now. So I was at the Cartagena summit last year, and I felt it in the room that Latin America was pivoting away from North America. Remember when we couldn't do an infrastructure project without American money or American blessing, and now we don't need them anymore? Remember that? We are pivoting away. I watched the 3 presidents from Colombia, United States, and Brazil on that dais, and the least impressive was the American president, by far. He wasn't briefed right, he stumbled over his words, and the 2 other presidents were eloquent about the values that were required to go ahead, and they embodied those values, which is the real definition of leadership. So we have this interesting choice. Colombia, since La Violencia and even farther back, has suffered with the issue of sovereignty. We never call it that, but that's what it is. A large portion of our land is controlled by non-state actor. We need all the money. We're the 3rd biggest recipient of investment, aid investment from the United States after players in the Middle East. And our economy is being impacted by the Chinese, and we're starting to be ignored by American politicians. This is an issue of sovereignty in Colombia. We don't control our cash flow, our land, our future. So my advice is this. As we move forward, let's put the values discussion at the forefront. Belief in competition, the relationship between work and achievement, long-term thinking, systems thinking, tolerance for people unlike ourselves, self-determination, interpersonal trust, where one Colombian citizen, just because he's a Colombian, meets any other Colombian and has a spontaneous sociability with that person. Let's put values at the basis of every discussion, and let's call up China. And again, this isn't just fun because it'll make the Americans' head blow up. Let's call up China and say, what do you need? Why don't you come and outsource in Colombia? Yeah, there'll be the talk of retaliation, trade issues. Yeah, there'll be all that. Why don't you come to Colombia, but not as a state-to-state relationship? That was the old China. The old China, you had a bilateral agreement and one-page contract. You give me your oil, I'll build you a road and a soccer stadium. Now, China is coming to these countries with multinational firms, parastatals, city, state, province, party, and national entities. And their contracts, because they started to hire Harvard Law people, or they started to put Chinese people through Harvard Law, contracts are as long as my arm. So I don't think the Colombian government needs to get close to the Chinese government, but I think the Colombian private sector has to get close to the Chinese private sector. And that will be the basis of an unbelievable explosion of innovation. That could be the basis for our self-determination as we play China and the United States a little bit against each other. That will be the basis for our tolerance for brand new ideas. That will be the basis for tax revenues that allows us to invest in the only investment with the possibility of infinite returns, to invest from behind the veil of ignorance in Colombian children. That's how it could work. So we started a discussion 20 years ago. It's always awkward to praise the most influential person in the room because it looks like you're kissing ass. But it happens to also be the truth. It was all Luis Alberto Moreno's idea. He pushed it as the champion from the start, and when it looked like it would sputter and die, he revived it. Then he revived it again. Then he found colleagues. Marta Lucia was one of the early champions, Catalina Crane. And I also want to recognize one other person. Because great ideas live and die 1,000 deaths. And they need that everyday champion to do this. I'd like you to help me recognize Christine Ternent. Because she took, yes, please. They can tell, they know. Very warm, they know. I don't have to tell them anything. Christine and I have had discussions very frequently over the last 20 years. And I can remember when competitiveness was about to die on the vine. I can remember many times. It would go away for a year or two. And Christine would keep rallying people, keep training people, keep looking for money, keep talking to the press, keep identifying the next generation. And she is truly what I once said in my fantastic Spanish, champiñone de competitividad, when I should have said campione de competitividad. So today, Christine, you're the mushroom of competitiveness. I want to honor you for that. Thank you very much for your attention.